progress going on, but mankind won't be destroyed. The fact that you and I are working here today is evidence of that. But mankind won't be destroyed. The fact that you and I are working here today is evidence of that.
Bom, muito boa tarde a
Well,
todas as pessoas
good
que vão nos
afternoon,
acompanhando agora
everybody
mesmo.
who's with
Uma
us
saudação a todas
live,
aquelas que vão nos assistir
and
posteriormente em gravação. Lembrando que
also
tudo isso
all
vai
of
ficar
you who will be
gravado no
watching
canal do
us
Lab Cidade
later
no
in the
YouTube.
recording. The
Eu sou o
recording will
Vitor
be
Inglesi, sou
available in the
pesquisador do
Lab
Lab
Cidades
Cidade e é
YouTube
com
channel.
muita
I'm
satisfação
Vitor
que a gente dá
Inglesi. I'm a
início a
researcher
essa
in
segunda
Lab
palestra
Cidades, and I'm very
do
happy
nosso
to
seminário internacional Políticas Habitacionais do Aluguel
introduce our
Social,
second
essa
lecture in
intitulada
our international
Ativismo no Campo
seminar
do Aluguel.
seminar
É, Bom, em um certo sentido, essa segunda palestra,
with
ela
the
é um
topic
desenvolvimento importante na dessa
social
que a gente acabou de
activism and
assistir,
rent.
e
And
ela
this
também
is
representa
an
uma
important
continuidade com um
topic in the
desdobramento
previous
da
panel, and
palestra
it
anterior,
also
que foi
represents a
ministrada ontem pela
continuity and an
professora Raquel
unfolding of the
Bonite,
previous
né, que com uma
lecture
imensa potência
by
crítica, ela
Dr.
revelou
Raquel
para nós
Boniti,
o nexo entre o
and she
aluguel,
revealed to
as suas
us the
novas
relationship between
configurações, né,
rent
e o
in
processo
its new
histórico no qual o
configurations and
espaço
the
urbano,
historical process
cidade,
through which the
particularmente a
urban space,
moradia,
the
né, tem
city,
se
and
convertido
especially
num ativo
housing,
financeiro.
has been turned
Ontem a
into a
professora Raquel
financial
também nos
asset.
ajudou a entender
Yesterday,
como que
Professor
essa crise
Raquel helped us
contemporânea do
understand
capitalismo, marcada pela
how this
especulação do
contemporary
capital,
crisis of capitalism,
imensos excedentes que
marked
buscam ser
by the
redistribuídos
speculation of
ativamente pelos
capital
fluxos financeiros que atravessam o
and
mundo todo, como que
several
ela está relacionada à
strategies to
habitação.
exploit
Tem sido um
capital all
importante
over the
mecanismo
world,
de
is
absorção desse
very much
capital
related to
fictício,
housing, a
e
mechanism
principalmente
used
como
to
o
absorb
aluguel
the
representa um
accumulated capital,
desenvolvimento desse
and
processo.
how
Por ser mais
rent
flexível,
represents
superar a fixidez de
another
uma
layer of the
plataforma,
process because it's more
transformar,
flexible
né, um pouco a
and it
moradia de um
turns
bem para um serviço a
housing
ser explorado,
from a
que
good
consegue
into a
mobilizar a
service to be
expectativa do
exploited
pagamento dos
because
aluguéis
it
dos inquilinos,
immobilizes
né,
the
como um ativo
expectation of
financeiro
the
que vai
payment
circular no
of
mercado
rent as a
e
financial
consegue
asset
transitar entre
that
as fronteiras porosas
circulates
do
in the market
formal e do
because it
informal,
can
especialmente
move between
nas sociedades assim
the
chamada
borders between
periferia do sistema
formal and
capitalista, né?
informal,
De modo que
especially in
tudo
the
isso
peripheries of
delineou para
the
nós um quadro muito
capitalist system.
complexo, assim, desde grandes
All of
senhorios
that to us represents
corporativos,
a very complex
articulados às plataformas que
situation
exploram o serviço de moradia
that
em novas
includes
configurações de
several
aluguel de
powerful
curta
landlords
duração, em
that are
apartamentos multifamilies,
associated
até os
to
pontos em
temporary
que esse
housing
processo toca o
enterprises
chão, onde
and
nos países,
multifamily
segundo o
arrangements.
assim chamado
And
núcleo, né, ou
these
assim chamada
processes have several
periferia do sistema
impacts,
capitalista, onde os
both in
mercados
the
informais de
countries
locação têm
of the
crescido também
nucleus or
muito,
the peripheries
né? O
of
que
the
nós vemos é o
capitalist
ônus
system, where
excessivo do
informal
aluguel
markets have really
passa a
grown. What
ganhar
we
cada
see
vez
is that
mais
the
peso e
excessive burden
importância na composição
with
do
rent
déficit
has gained
habitacional,
weight
né?
and
Ou seja, o
importance in
peso
the
maior do
composition
aluguel na crise
of the housing
habitacional,
deficit.
no mundo
So
todo.
the increasing
E com isso
weight
suscitam-se
of
novas
rent in
formas
the
de
housing
luta, né?
deficit
Novas formas de
crisis
resistência
is
organizada a esses processos,
really
né?
expressive in the entire
E
world.
esse é o
And
tema
with
do
that,
debate de agora,
uh,
né?
I
Então é com muita
introduce the topic of
satisfação que a gente
today's
dá as
debate,
boas-vindas a duas
and I'm very
importantes
happy to
pesquisadoras e
welcome two
militantes da
very
sua
important
luta,
researchers
né?
and activists.
A Luci Cavallero é
Luci
socióloga e
Cavallero
pesquisadora da
is a
Universidade de Buenos
sociologist.
Aires. O
She's a
trabalho dela
researcher in
aborda
the
um pouco
University of Buenos
dívida,
Aires.
capital
Her
ilegal e
work
violências.
deals with debt,
Publicou livros
illegal
como
capital,
O
and
Motorista
violence.
Feminista da
She has
Dívida,
published
La Casa como
books
Laboratório, Finanças
like La Casa como
Vivenda e Trabalho
Laboratorio,
Essencial, com Verônica Gago. E
Finanças de Venda e Trabalho
recentemente organizou com a
Essencial
Silvia
with Veronica
Federici e
Garro,
a
and
Verônica
recently she
Gago
organized
em
with Silvia
DST,
Federici
Ensaios
the
Transnacionais de
book
Desobediência
Who Owns
Financeira.
Who?
Vários
Transnational
publicados
Essays
em
of
inglês.
Financial
Ela é
Disobedience,
integrante do Ni Una
several of which
Menos
have been
e esteve
translated
envolvida
into English.
recentemente
She's
nas
a
lutas
member of
pela
Ni Una
regulação do
Menos, and
aluguel em
she has
Buenos
been
Aires, na
engaged in the fight
Argentina,
for
junto ao
the
movimento
regulation of rents in
Inquilinos
Argentina
Agrupados,
with the
e
grouped
a Marnie
tenants
Brady,
movement,
que é
and
PhD,
Marnie
é
Brady,
professora associada de Política e Direitos
PhD,
Humanos da
Associate Professor
Marymount
in
Manhattan
Policy and Human
College, na
Rights in the
cidade de Nova
Marymount
York. A
Manhattan
pesquisa dela
College in the
examina a
city of New
relação
York. Her
contemporânea entre
research
trabalho,
examines
terra
the
e
contemporary
moradia.
relationship between
Seus
work,
ensaios e estudos de
land, and
casos se
housing,
concentram em políticos
and
urbanos
her
e movimentos
essays and
sociais.
study
Foram
cases
publicados
concentrate
em
in urban policy and
Progressive
social movements have been
Planning of
published
Race Cities, the International Journal of Urban Policy
in
and
the
Planning, e
International
nos volumes
Journal of
New
Urban Policy
Labor
and
em Nova
Planning
York
and
e
in the
Revolt em New
volumes New
York,
Labor in
How
New York
400
and
Years of
Revolting New
Riot,
York,
Rebellion,
how
Uprising
400
and
years of
Revolution
riot,
Shaped the
rebellion,
City.
uprising, and revolution
Atualmente ela
shaped the
atua
city.
como
She
co-âncora do
currently
Comitê de Política
acts
e
as a
Pesquisa da
co-anchor
Right to the
of the
City
Committee of Policy and
Alliance
Research
Nacional, em um
of
grupo
the Right to the
sediado
City
nos Estados
Alliance
Unidos que une
National,
campanhas locais de
and
construção de
a group
base
that is
e
headquartered in the US
organização e políticas para defender
that
bairros e construir um movimento
organizes
robusto e
policies to
rastreável para
defend neighborhoods
recuperar,
and build a
permanecer e
robust movement to
reconstruir
recover
comunidades.
remain
sejam
and
muito
rebuild
bem-vindas,
communities. So
a
welcome,
Marnie,
both of
muito
you.
bem-vinda,
Marnie,
Luci
welcome.
também, acho que
Lucy,
está
welcome.
a
I don't
palestrar,
think
né?
she has joined us yet, but she will be joining us shortly.
O nosso formato é cada
So, our
vai
format
ter
is each one
sucessivamente
of
30
you will
minutos,
have
tá, para fazer a
30 minutes
apresentação.
to give
Faltando
your
5
presentation.
minutos para acabar
And
o
when you
tempo,
have five
eu
minutes
vou abrir
left,
meu
I
microfone
will
para
open
avisar,
my
tá? Eu
microphone
já
and
peço
let you
desculpas de
know.
antemão
I apologize
por
beforehand because
fazer
I'll have
esse vídeo há
to
muito tempo, mas vai ser necessário para a
control
gente
your
fechar
time,
o
but it will
debate
be
dentro do
necessary for us
tempo que
to
foi
conclude the
planejado,
debate
tá?
within the
E
allotted
depois
time.
dessas exposições de
And
30 minutos,
after the
eu vou
30-minute
abrir para um
presentations,
debate
I
de
will
40
open
minutos,
for
tá?
a 40-minute
Onde
debate
todas as pessoas que estão nos
where
acompanhando,
everyone who is
especialmente
watching
pelo
us,
YouTube, podem
especially on
fazer
YouTube, will
perguntas,
be able to
comentários,
ask
reflexões no
questions, make
chat,
comments and
e nós vamos
reflections
passar
in the
para a
chat,
Luci, para a
and
Marnie,
we
para
will transmit the questions
alimentar
to
o
Lucy, to
debate, tá
Marnie,
bom?
to feed the debate.
Então, Marnie, mais uma
So,
vez,
Marnie,
muito
once
obrigado
again,
pela
thank you very
presença.
much for being here,
E eu passo a palavra para você,
and
tá, para a
you now have
exposição
the
de 30
floor
minutos.
for 30 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victor. And thank you, Paula Santoro and Carol Held, for the invitation today. I am so happy to be here with all of you. And I really look forward to the discussion with Lucia Cavallero. So my talk begins with just a few remarks on the election in the United States before turning to a few data points on the pace and scale of housing financialization, specifically in the United States, and how this has shaped the measure of demands of tenants here. And please let me know if I'm speaking too fast to the interpreter, and I can slow down. So nearly 15 years ago, in the midst of the global finance and foreclosure crisis, those of us in the housing justice movement here in New York City, we were really fortunate to have then UN Rapporteur Raquel Rolnick really very much bearing witness to the dilemmas of public housing as residents were contending with newly proposed privatization plans for public housing, threats to sell the air rights, and to allow for private capital conversions. And it was Dr. Rolnick who really at that time demonstrated to so many of us how to combine the rigor of multi-scalar analysis with an ethos of empathetic engagement and curiosity. In New York City, in the capital of capital, Dr. Rolnick and those conditions challenged us to consider the increasing financialization of housing as a temporal and spatial fix to capital crisis that extends crisis. And indeed, across the United States at the close of 2024, it is rare to hear housing without its adjoining adjective, crisis. There's not one county in the United States where the minimum wage can support the cost of rent, which is a problem of not affording rent, but affording debt obligations. And this helps to explain, I think, how we arrived at yesterday's election results. Let me just say that in the conjunctural analysis within different movement spaces, such as the Right to the City Alliance here in the United States, which is a 90-member base building alliance, we really view the results of the presidential election and the Senate elections here as a response to the failures of neoliberalism, involving, on the one hand, the privatization of all forms of public services, including public housing, and diminished worker power. And on the other hand, the innovations of finance institutions to seek increasing debt obligations within everyday life and to profit off that debt. So this, of course, as we've also been bearing witness, has been accompanied by an expansive state of policing and militarism that has involved all different kinds of domicide and property violence, as Lucia might say, following racialized and gendered logics. So these failures caused a crisis of faith in establishment politics that has long existed, but specifically at this moment, the far right, MAGA, emerged as a false solution to the failures of the neoliberal coalition establishment. MAGA, represented by Trump, masked the misuse of power and massive wage theft by victim blaming, pointing the finger at immigrants, those who have faced the severest effects of global neoliberalism, the uprootedness of home, serial displacements, and, as we know, dangerous crossings. So this extreme right is distinctive, but also very much related to forms of existing neoliberalism. Yet this extreme right is very specific in its efforts to consolidate white power and heteropatriarchy. And within the logics of those hierarchies, also extends the logics of financialization and debt. So there has been a deep denial of grief, the grief of foreclosures and eviction losses, of COVID losses, the losses of genocide and extensive militarism, all propelled by the very state in question, which made the status quo neoliberalism, this coalition that we've had for many decades strong, untenable. So what matters, I think today, and for all of us in relationship to our work and thinking together, is far more than any election, and that is the transformative power of people who come to see ourselves as social beings whose measure of demands and responsibility is to each other. This is a break from the isolation of individualism, which is the psychology of neoliberalism. And so all of us who are committed to demonstrating by example, life-affirming communities, we must endeavor to cook with what we've got in the kitchen, which is, to borrow a metaphor, which is to be resourceful and strategic with our capacities based on astute analysis of power, which I can see has been very much happening within this tremendous seminar, and also forthcoming with our political imagination. And this is why I'm so pleased to be here, especially today, to talk about renters' rights and endeavors for social housing and socializing housing that are ongoing in the United States, have built quite a bit of momentum since the pandemic, and I believe will gain momentum to withstand and maybe even transform this harrowing political context in which we have found ourselves. And so because we so desperately need to build our way out of neoliberal failures and into relations of collective social obligation, at this day, for all of us committed to homes and cities, not as products, but as practices of social solidarity, we, I think, just have to continue to ask ourselves, if it's not us, then who? If not now, then when? And if not from here, then from where? So now I'd like to turn to two questions that will shape my talk around how financialization has shaped the scale and pace of the housing crisis, specifically here, and then how do these conditions shape the measure of renters' demands to assert and to defend tenant rights? So I'll begin by briefly just highlighting a few data points. The US may be a preferred market for speculative investment in certain forms of housing. Yet, as we know well, the bundling of homes and communities into portfolios as financial assets globalizes the risk of gambling on rent and debt. And then I'll present a few examples of housing dilemmas in the US that demonstrate both roads not taken and this growing movement to socialize housing. So this would be great time to share screen of my slides, if that's possible. And perhaps that's happening. Great. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. I wasn't on that. Okay. To go to the first screen, I just have a few data points to share on the financialization of housing. This is a depiction of global real estate assets under management. I first want to say a few words and then describe what is on this visual, this chart. So the same regulatory shifts that helped to avert a much more widespread pandemic foreclosure crisis in the single family residential market also facilitated large corporations in the pandemic period to draw upon credit for expansive new purchasing of mortgage-backed securities and distressed mortgages. And this credit access combines with a surplus of cash reserves that are held as dry powder by private equity real estate. And dry powder refers to funds committed to portfolio managers, to financial institutions for placement, for transactions. And I just want to draw your attention here that, and this comes from Prekin, which is a private equity database that I have access to through an affiliation with NYU. Prekin, I just want to say something about this source, this data source. It is a proprietary data source used by private equity funds to kind of monitor private equity funds and also for research. And if there is a specific research question that someone might be interested in this seminar around a specific fund, please do let me know and I can attempt to get your data point. I'd like to just open up that resource that I have to all of you. So this is just a shot of global assets under management, including dry powder, which is capital committed to private equity. This is specifically for residential real estate. And what you can see is this tremendous increase from 2000, it's very tiny, probably on your screen, all the way to 2024, where there are $603 billion of dry powder alone dedicated to finding placement in the private equity backed real estate, including residential, multifamily, single family, mostly in North America, which would be up to an unrealized value estimated at more than $1 trillion. This is for just 2024 alone, actually only up to March 2024. And as you might see here, when the COVID downturn began in 2020 and then just into 2021, private equity held an enormous pool of these investors' funds for opportunistic investments. Just by the end of 2019, before 2020, there was 142 billion in dry powder. And as of May 2020, private equity investors globally held 328 billion in cash reserves, again, capital seeking placement for real estate investment. 4 years later, we are now at 603.7 billion US dollars in capital, again, seeking investment. The real estate industry in general took on tremendous debt when it was cheap. The amount of debt that will need to be refinanced in the next year or two makes it likely that this dry powder will be spent on distressed assets. Because of how lucrative rising rents are in the United States, we expect some of this dry powder to also be invested in multifamily. Blackstone last year, Blackstone being one of the largest private equity real estate investors in the United States, but globally, took on a multifamily real estate investment trust that was public, brought it private, and that was for $10 billion. Blackstone has also begun to invest in affordable housing. These are tax credit portfolios here in the United States. What's challenging about private equity specifically is they do not need to report to regulators about how much they're lending, how much capital they're holding, and how their loans are performing. No one, not the private funds, investment advisors, US regulators, collect the kinds of information needed to understand who are the investors, the limited partners who have committed this dry powder and who have been recruited into private equity as the source of private equity investment funds in order to better calibrate potential systemic risks posed to global markets. We do know, of course, that there are many different institutional investors in private equity, and especially in real estate, those being public pension and private pension funds. Okay, if we could just go to slide 2, the next slide. So, and I think this might be an extension from your last seminar with Dr. Rolnick. Financialization involves creating products and means such as rent mobility through which financial institutions seek to profit from debt, betting and gambling on whether those who are subjects of indebtedness will be in a position to afford that debt. And within the global finance crisis, tenants came to understand that whether as bank tenant, owner, mortgage holder, or renter, they were meant to make the obligation of financial debt as a claim on their future labor, their homes, and their collective community value. And so when millions of those who were foreclosed upon became renters at that time, Wall Street committed to an expansion of rent accumulation through the securitization of foreclosed homes turned into single-family rentals. This is in the United States, but again, by globalizing risk. Wall Street investments in multifamily apartments has been unabated since the foreclosure crisis. And by 2015, the share of apartments with individual landlords fell below 50%, meaning mom and pop, who we call individual landlords here, as these landlords were replaced by corporate players, particularly in bigger buildings. This has only increased since COVID-19. Important here is just to note that this kind of dry capital commitments from limited partner investors was also made possible because of the state's infusion of cash at the foreclosure crisis and then during the pandemic from the Federal Reserve in the foreclosure crisis to bail out banks, and during the pandemic, again, to infuse through all different kinds of openings for private equity to be able to participate in the housing market that quickly reopened. This was an inflection point at the foreclosure crisis for the housing justice movement, an important time for forging these new solidarities between the foreclosed and renters, and again, connecting mortgage debt in both the single family and multifamily as pervasive housing risks to renters and owners alike. So in this chart, which is of US residential portfolio deals of private equity, again from Prekin, this is just from 2000 to 2022. This, the chart itself, the lines that are the bar graphs demonstrate the number of deals, whereas the line bar that is pink represents the total value of those deals for any given year. So this goes till 2022, where you can see that in that year, the volume of deals was 2,095 in private equity backed investments in real estate, worth $92.7 billion just that year alone in 2022. So capital markets haven't just increased their real estate reach in investment dollars, but this really shows that post 2008, also in the volume of deals. An increased yield requires greater speed of transactions, aided, of course, by technology and by the structure of the private equity real estate model, which entails funds of funds. So here you can see that these deals that have only increased are the interfaces of capital and debt exchange that capture profits as fees through the financial channels that manage them. And since 2000, investors have paid private equity funds roughly $7.5 billion in fees alone for management around the transaction of these deals and management of these funds each year. So tenants at very localized scales grapple with owners who are no longer the landlord down the block, but rather who represent a global network of investors, often backed by private equity, often living in these deals, so-called deals that are portfolios, that are communities, that are homes. The COVID-19 crisis created new opportunities for the global finance industry in order to advance further in the housing market, as you can see in these graphs, deepening housing insecurity in the short and long term. And it is in this aftermath of the pandemic that the dynamics of financialization, of housing, this phenomenon of capital circulation, debt exchange, and fee extraction in residential real estate that really establishes the context for tenant struggles. At the same time, tenant resistance has shifted its scalar strategies, notably in the US, translocal and national campaigns during the pandemic to cancel the rent emerged with some new sympathies, suggesting a growing public at that time questioning the traditional interdependencies, such as those of the owner-renter. So if you could just go to the next slide. After this description of financialization, I'm going to jump into some of these struggles. I did just want to say that altogether, and to demonstrate here, oh, I think I might have missed the slide. Yes, just that the US residential market altogether gained in value $15.5 trillion between 2020 and 2024 alone, from the pandemic to March 2024, which is where these last numbers stand. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So this period certainly contrasts the tremendous impacts of the foreclosure crisis of more than a decade ago, when almost 1/3 of all US homeowners were underwater in 2012. But I did want to point to some of the lessons and actions in the wake of the foreclosure crisis here, which was also a renters crisis. These were largely responses that were defensive to defend tenant rights, defend the right to stay put, the right to home in the case of many of those who were foreclosed, who attempted and sometimes did win through all different kinds of eviction blockades, the foreclosure of their homes. So within that period, we saw generally just a new push from municipalities all the way through labor unions who are controlling different public sector pension boards to have greater transparency of speculative real estate. It is based on a lot of different action in that time period that we now have a speculation watch list in New York City. This is based on data that the city, the municipality, produces, looking at speculation through debt service coverage ratios and attempting to have a database that will allow for some proactive inspections of places where there is heightened speculation risk, knowing where renters are most likely to face harassment in buildings with the greatest likelihood of mortgage defaults. And this really helps New York City just in relationship to leveraging the tools that we do have as a city for code enforcement, as well as for protecting tenants' rights to organize and potentially for funds to allow for ownership transfer to tenants, which is not a right, but is a possibility. So there are about 182 rent stabilized multifamily properties right now on the New York City speculation watch list. These properties are at high risk of distress. They are private equity backed. They're at high risk of debt obligation by tenants and at high risk of eventual potential tenant eviction. So like private equity investments elsewhere, these portfolios have become loaded with debt. And when credit was very cheap, at the height of the pandemic, there was a lot of credit that was leveraged against multifamily buildings. So given that many of the institutional investors are public pensions, we've also had some tiny reforms around transparency in relationship to the huge sums of transfers of people's deferred wages, their retirements for those who are lucky to have them, to private equity as, again, an attempt for profiting off this leverage of credit as debt that results in all different kinds of rent squeezing. And oftentimes with those renters being people who work in the public sector, like teachers, who may be actually the tenants who are also subjected to these increases in rents and are seeking to have a retirement in the future. In just this year, in 2024, New York City's employment retirement system, which is at the municipal level, issued a whole new set of principles around investment in single-family rentals and multifamily rentals in response to tenant organizing, involving provisions that, again, require data disclosures, attempts to mitigate evictions. This also occurred in California in response to the lessons of losing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on speculative portfolios. And I'm talking about, again, the deferred wages of workers in the public sector.
Just to let you know, 5 more minutes, okay?
Okay, so moving forward, much of what was also gained from just the lessons of 2008 was the need for defending tenant rights, and several campaigns beginning in New York City and now in several states ensure the right to counsel, to legal counsel in housing court. And another very, very important fight that has been waged here in New York City has been to preserve public housing that had been left for distress without federal and adequate state funds for any kinds of adequate maintenance. And as we have seen the loss, the demolition of public housing all over this country, in New York City, NYCHA residents have been organized and in some buildings absolutely militant to preserve their housing and also to fend off privatization. which is occurring. Privatization has existed over the last 8 years with new exposure to private development for conversion of public housing to what we call project-based Section 8, which is a voucher system, but in this case, allowing for existing buildings to have those vouchers as rent subsidies attached to the unit rather than mobile with the renter, which is another form of Section 8. But within the lessons and actions of COVID-19, renters who have been subjected to the many different embedded debt obligations of finance capital have been on the offensive, both in the period of COVID to cancel the rent, to have eviction moratoria, which was first one in New York State, but also to expand rent control, rent caps, rent stabilization at the state level, and also to bans at the state level to allow for municipalities to legislate. This has been successful. We just won in New York State good cause eviction, which is also opening up a form of rent stabilization expansion in New York State beyond those buildings that are already covered in New York City for rent stabilization. And there have been many other campaigns that have been successful, including in the state of Oregon, for expanding statewide rent control. What now is really something that I hope to get into further with Lucia is the call, the demand, and actually the enactment of several different social housing proposals from the federal level, a recent Homes Act, which is excellent for anyone who would like to just see the narrative of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's legislation, really, really excellent to do so. But we don't see any hope of that happening at the federal level, but instead provides some architecture, so to speak, of policy around social housing proposals at the New York or any state level, as well as with mechanisms that are important for municipalities, including the tenant right to purchase, community opportunity to purchase, the use of public land for publicly controlled, publicly owned social housing. So with that, I hope to get much more into some of these endeavors around the organizing for social housing in our discussion. So thank you.
Muito obrigado, Marnie, pela exposição extremamente
Thank you very
esclarecedora.
much, Marnie,
Muito
for your very
importante
enlightening
que a
presentation.
seja,
And it's
né,
very
muito
important
uma conjuntura bastante
since we're
adversa.
going through such a very hard
Muito
day
obrigado. Eu vou passar
and in
agora
such a
a
negative
palavra para
context
Luci
to have your
Cavallero.
presentation. And I will now pass the
Luci,
floor
seja muito
to Luci
bem-vinda.
Cavallero. Welcome,
Uma
Lucy.
exposição de 30 minutos, tá?
You have 30 minutes.
E eu também já peço desculpas de antemão,
And
mas eu vou
I
sinalizar
apologize
faltando 5
beforehand, but
minutos, tá?
I will let
Só
you know
para que você
when
possa
you
se
have 5
programar,
minutes
né,
left,
mais
just so that you can
da
move towards the
apresentação,
end
tá
of your
bom? Então passo a
presentation,
palavra
okay?
para você. Muito
So I'll
obrigado.
pass the floor to you, and thank you.
Muchas gracias, Víctor. Muchas gracias por la
Thank you very much,
invitación.
Victor. Thank you for inviting me.
Bueno,
Well,
tengo preparado primero una introducción
first I prepared an introduction,
hablada, pero luego quería compartir un documento con ustedes. No sé si estoy
and I also would like to
habilitada
share a
compartiendo.
document with you. I don't know if I can share my screen.
Hay un
Yes, you
share.
can. You can.
Ok,
Just click on
Verde,
share
abajo.
in green
sí.
in the lower
Eh,
toolbar.
Pero si
Okay.
lo logras, puede
But if you're
pasar.
not able to do that, oh no, there you go.
Bueno. Ok.
Great.
Bueno,
Well,
primero contarles que
first,
estoy
I'd
hablando
like to
desde
tell you that I'm
Argentina,
speaking
bueno, en
from
una situación
Argentina,
muy especial que a veces
where we are in a
hace
very specific
que tener
situation.
tiempo para la investigación para la escritura se
that
vuelva
causes
un
us
privilegio,
to,
porque estamos
where
en una situación
having
en donde
time
hay un
to
ataque muy
do
fuerte a la
research and to
educación
study
pública,
is a privilege
el
because
salario de los
public
docentes
education
es cada vez más
is
por encima
being
de la pobreza.
attacked.
Y bueno,
The
quienes tratamos de
salary of
combinar
professors
nuestra
is equal to poverty
tarea
here,
militante con la
and
de la
we are
investigación, a
combining
veces
our
en este momento se
activist
vuelven
task
incompatibles
with
en algún punto.
research, and sometimes that's
Primero
not
quería
compatible.
compartirles
Well, first, I'd like to share
cuál es el contexto de
the
la lucha inquilina en
context
Argentina.
of the
Argentina es un país
rent
que desde
and social rent in
1943
Argentina.
hasta
Argentina is a country that
1976
ever since
el Estado intervenía fuertemente en
1943,
el
the
mercado de
state has
alquileres,
been strongly
regulando, por
intervening
ejemplo,
in
los
the rental
precios
market, regulating the
del alquiler
prices, for
e
example,
incluso con
of
contratos que
rents,
duraban
actually with
indefinidamente.
contracts that would
Todo
last
esto fue
for an
interrumpido
indefinite
y
period. And
cambiado
all of that was
estructuralmente por la
interrupted
dictadura
and
militar
changed
de
structurally
1976. Y ese
due
es
to
un
the
punto de
military
inflexión y es muy
dictatorship in
importante porque es
1976.
importante recordar estos momentos de
And this was
inflexión
a turning
histórica
point
porque
because
desde
it's
nuestro punto de vista
important
y
to
la
remember
evaluación que tenemos desde las
these
agrupaciones
historic
que estamos
turning
luchando
points that really
por el acceso a la
change
vivienda como un derecho, estamos en este momento en un
our
punto de
fight for
inflexión
access to
que
housing
tiene
as a
mucha
right. We are
continuidad con
currently
los
in a
cambios
turning
estructurales
point
que intentó hacer la
that is
dictadura
very
militar.
much related to
La
the
dictadura
structural
militar
changes that
produce
happened
dos
during
cambios
the military dictatorship.
fundamentales que van a
The
empezar
military
a cambiar
dictatorship produced two
radicalmente
fundamental
el mercado
changes
de
that
alquileres en
really changed
Argentina.
the rent market in
Uno de ellos va a
Argentina.
ser la aparición
One of them is
de
the
los primeros
appearance of
avisos
the
en dólares
first
de las viviendas. Hasta ese
dollar
momento, el
announcements
dólar no
of
era
rents.
utilizado en Argentina
Up
como
until
referencia
then,
ni para
dollar
la
was
compra
not
ni para la venta
used
de
in
viviendas,
Argentina
y
as
mucho menos
a
para el ahorro,
reference,
¿no? Y la
not
dictadura
for the
militar,
purchasing of
a fuerza
property
de
and not for
insurrección, a
renting
fuerza de la
out
represión
property.
de la organización
And
popular,
the
ha tenido
repression of
numerosos
popular
objetivos,
organizations
además
in
del
Argentina had,
endeudamiento
in addition
acelerado que
to
como vía
other
Argentina,
goals,
ha tenido un
in
objetivo que
addition
es,
to the
bueno, una
increased indebtedness
financiarización de
of
la
the
población,
Argentinian
donde
population,
el
the
proyecto
goal
más
was also a
cercano a la financiarización
financialization
fue el
of
de
the
la
population, and the
dolarización
project attached to
del
that was
uso
the
cultural del
dollarization,
dinero.
and
Y
actually
entonces hay un
cultural
proceso de
dollarization
dolarización
as
del
well.
mercado de alquileres y un
So
proceso
we
de
had a
desregulación
dollarization
que
process of the rental
lo que
market
hace
and a
justamente es
deregularization
desregular
process,
completamente el mercado de
which
vivienda
really
en alquiler
completely
que había estado regulado hasta
deregularized the housing
1976.
market that was
El problema
regulated
que
up until
hay
then.
justamente
And the
en
problem
Argentina
is
es
that
que
in Argentina,
la concentración
the concentration of
digamos, el porcentaje de inquilinos
the
ha crecido
percentage of
incluso en
tenants
los
has
momentos,
grown,
viene creciendo incluso durante los
including,
gobiernos democráticos
well,
y
during democratic
crece
governments,
tanto si la
and
economía se encuentra en procesos de
has
crecimiento
been
como en
growing
procesos
both if the
recesivos. Es
economy is
decir,
growing or if we're
el
going
proceso
through
de
a recession.
tenanticización es
So
permanente
the
y casi se han
tenantization
duplicado la
process is
cantidad de
permanent
inquilinos
and has
en la
almost
ciudad de Buenos
doubled the
Aires
amount
en
of
los últimos
tenants
10
in the city of
años.
Buenos Aires in
Sin
the last 10
embargo, la
years.
construcción de vivienda no para.
However, the
Esa es la
building
paradoja.
of
Se
houses
construye
is
vivienda
still in full
permanentemente
force.
y al mismo tiempo crece
And
la
at the same
cantidad de
time that we're
inquilinos.
building housing,
Para
the
que,
amount of
y
tenants
eso
has
es una
increased.
disputa muy grande
And this is
que
a
estamos dando incluso
very
con toda la clase política, porque
important
hay una
dispute that
traición
we are
muy grande
having
en
with the
Argentina, incluso de
entire
los partidos
political
progresistas o de
class
izquierda,
because we have a betrayal
de
even of the left
restringir la agenda del
wing
acceso a la
parties
vivienda únicamente a la
that
construcción de
is
viviendas.
restricting the agenda to access to housing
Y casi que no está en el
to
imaginario
a matter of the
político
construction market.
actualmente
And
la idea de una
currently,
regulación del mercado de
the
alquileres,
idea
a
of
pesar de que es la principal
regulating
forma de
the
acceso a la
rental
vivienda
market,
de quienes
even
viven
though
sin
it is the
trabajo.
main form of access, is not really supported.
Entonces, estamos en un proceso de
So we are
inquilinización
in a
muy
process
fuerte y sobre
of
todo en la ciudad de Buenos Aires,
increased
que crece al
rent-based
mismo tiempo que
living in
crece
the city of
la
Buenos
construcción de
Aires,
viviendas.
growing at the same time that the construction of
Hay un
housing
momento que es
market is growing.
para nosotros que es un
And
punto de inflexión, que es el
a turning point
2020,
for us was
donde se sanciona
2020,
por
where
primera vez una ley de alquileres
it
durante la
was the first
pandemia,
time that a rent law
construida
was sanctioned during the
en base a
pandemic,
una organización,
based
surgimiento
on
del sindicato de inquilinos
the
de la ciudad de
emergence
Buenos
of the
Aires, que se
tenants
transforma en una
union in the
federación
city of
nacional,
Buenos Aires,
se transforma en un actor de la política nacional
which
por primera
became an
vez.
actor in the
Y
national
se sanciona
politics
una ley de
and in the
alquileres
national housing
durante la
policy.
pandemia
This
que
law
implicó
was
por primera
sanctioned
vez,
during the pandemic, and for the first
desde la
time,
vuelta de la democracia, a
ever
pesar de que
since
hubo en un
we
gobierno,
returned to
hubo
democracy,
una ley de alquileres que fue menos,
even though
que
at the
regulaba muchos
time
menos aspectos de lo que esta
the
ley
government
funcionó en
had
pandemia
a
se
rent
propuso
law that
regular.
regulated
Esta ley, entre otras
much
cosas,
less things
establecía,
than this one
y lo hablo en pasado
during the pandemic. And this law
porque fue
at the
derogada
time
por el gobierno
used to
actual de
establish, and I
ultraderecha,
speak
ahora
in
me
the
voy a
past
referir a ese
because it was
proceso.
revoked by the
Esta
current
ley de alquileres
administration,
fue
this rent
durante la
law
democracia el intento más importante y
was
sobre
during
todo
our
construido
democratic
desde
period
abajo y con
was
las
the
organizaciones inquilinos
most
como
important
protagonistas
attempt
de
that was
empezar
built
a
with
regular el
tenants
mercado de
organizations
alquileres.
as protagonists
Estableció
to start
por primera
regulating
vez
the rent
una
market.
duración,
And it was the
una
first
frecuencia
time
de
that it
contratos entre
established
3
a
años,
frequency of
una,
contracts for
una
3 years.
estableció
It established
una frecuencia
a
de actualización anual y los dos puntos más importantes que
frequency
van a desatar
and
una
of
contraofensiva
updating
muy
of
importante
prices
del
on an
mercado
yearly
inmobiliario
basis.
tienen que
And
ver con
something that was really important here in the real estate market is
el
related
establecimiento
to
de un
the
índice
establishment of
para la actualización que es un
an
promedio
index for the
entre
updating of
el
prices,
salario y la
which
inflación,
is an
y sobre
average
todo un
between
número
salary and
público.
inflation,
Esa
and
ley
it's a
lo que
public
obliga al Estado
number.
es a
So this law
publicar
makes
cuál tiene
the
que ser
state
el
publish
porcentaje de actualización anual
this
de los
percentage
alquileres
for
en
the
la página del Banco
yearly
Central,
update of rent
algo que había
prices in the
sido
world in the
totalmente
central bank
arbitrario
page,
hasta ese momento.
something that
Y
had
el otro
been
punto
completely
importante fue
arbitrary
la
up until then.
obligación de la
And another
registración de los
important
contratos.
point was
Sabemos
an
que uno de los
obligation
problemas grandes
to
que tenemos en los países de
register
Latinoamérica
contracts. A
es
problem that we have
la
in Latin American
economía
countries
submergida, es la economía
is
informal
the
y sobre todo la
informal
evasión fiscal.
economy.
Esta ley establecía una
And
obligación
this law
para
established an
que
obligation
los propietarios tengan que
for
registrar
the
ante los entes
landowners and the
recaudadores
landlords having to
el contrato de
record
alquiler.
the rent
Pues bien, esta
contracts.
ley se sanciona en pandemia y genera
And
una
this law was
contraofensiva
enacted in the pandemic,
importante,
and
mediática y
it
articulada con
was
sectores de
really
la clase política
criticized in
que
the
luego
media
se
and by the
transformarán
sectors in the
en
political class
referentes
that
del actual gobierno de ultraderecha.
are now part of the current
¿Cómo
extreme
se
right government.
desarrolla esta ofensiva del mercado? Bueno, en primer lugar,
And this launched a real market
se,
offensive that happened
se basa
first
en la disputa por los números públicos.
based on the
Punto
dispute
importante. Es
for
decir, los
public
medios de comunicación
opinion.
permanentemente se hacen
And the
ecos de
communication means the
estadísticas o
media
de números publicados por el propio mercado
usually
inmobiliario en sus
uses
sitios de oferta
statistics
de
and numbers
vivienda.
published by the real
Por
estate
ejemplo,
market.
esos
For
sitios de vivienda
example,
son los que se ocuparon de
these
instalar la idea de que la ley de alquileres hizo
media
bajar la
outlets
oferta de
installed
viviendas
the
en alquiler.
idea that the
Es decir,
law, the
proceso de
rent law, would
culpabilización de la
lower
ley,
the
¿no?
offer of rental
Permanentemente los
properties.
medios de
So
comunicación
placing blame in the law,
funcionaba el discurso de que a partir de la
and
regulación del
the
mercado de
media
alquileres la
also
gente
voiced the
decidía no
discourse
poner
that
la vivienda en oferta de alquiler.
this law
Eso se volvió
caused
sentido común,
people
incluso
not
fue
to offer
repetido
houses
por
for rent.
parte
And
de
this was
del
repeated by
propio
part
sector
of
de
the
izquierda, ¿no? Esa idea de que
left-right
cualquier
sector, this
regulación
idea that any
genera
regulation
automáticamente
would
una culpabilización sobre
automatically
los propios
create
movimientos que
a
proponen esa regulación
blaming
y
of
que
the
ahuyenta
movements that are proposing this
la puesta
regulation,
de viviendas en oferta.
and that causes the
Además,
lack of
hubo
offer
bueno,
of
una
houses.
articulación en cómo
And
en la ofensiva mediática con
there was an
sectores
articulation
de
between that
mercado
media
inmobiliario que
offensive
también se
and real
transformaron
estate market
a los
sectors
jueces
that
y en
also
permanentes
became permanent
expertos en acceso a la vivienda
experts
en los
in
medios
access to
de
housing
comunicación.
in the media outlets. And they
Quisiera
were often
detenerme en
interviewed
un
about
punto que
this.
para mí es importante y es
And a
cómo
point that it's important to
nuestra
me
práctica
is
militante es desde el feminismo, desde el movimiento
our
Ni Una
activist
Menos, que fue
practice
y
is
es un
feminism
movimiento
in the
que desde
Niño
su
and
inicio
Menos
lucha contra la violencia de género
movement that
y
fights
que en la
against
pandemia
gender-based
hemos
violence. And
decidido
during the pandemic,
ingresar en un
we
proceso de
decided
confluencia
to
con el sindicato y con la
join
agrupación de
forces
inquilinos e
with
inquilinas.
the tenants union and
Y
the
es
tenants
importante,
movement.
desde mi punto de vista,
And it's
darle
important from my perspective to give you
un
a
contexto político al por qué
political context of why we chose to come together, because we need cross-cutting alliances to fight for housing, and we also need feminisms to become popular and street-based, and that can take up the main demands of the working class. And currently, access to housing is one of the central demands of the labor class. And during the pandemic, we started receiving in our webpage and also in the assemblies where we would discuss organization processes for the feminist movement, a central demand related to the impossibility of moving away from violent situations associated to the housing crisis. And this, in a way, caused our feminist agenda to have contact points to the tenants organizations. And so there was a growth in the discussion on the access to housing in feminist organizations. And what happens in the pandemic? The pandemic is a turning point for this confluence between feminism and the tenants movements. And the pandemic was somewhat of a lab, both because we saw as never before the importance of access to housing, because there were many people in Argentina that were not able to socially isolate and to remain in their houses because they didn't have a house. And the housing crisis was very much worsened, and how real estate speculation didn't stop during the pandemic. And at that moment, we established a relationship in a moment when the pandemic, for many women, became a mandate of having to coexist with their abusers and not be able to escape situations of violence. Having access to housing was paramount. And we had been working within the Menos movement, the discussion of how women, based on the processes promoted by the IDB, were becoming more and more indebted to respond to needs related to social reproduction. And why do I say this? Because one of our main claims as a feminist movement against uh, economic violence was fighting against the indebtedness for our mere livelihood. And the pandemic in Argentina meant that rent became a huge source of indebtedness. If before there was a strong evidence about this, during the pandemic, when we asked the women, and it's important to say that we work with single women households, and that's where we have the highest numbers of indebtedness. And we say that reproductive work and non-paid labor is penalized with more indebtedness. So rent became a new source of debt. And another important point to think about this financialization of housing is accessing to housing and rent many times implies in becoming indebted. And indebtedness in the pandemic is considered as a possibility to avoid eviction. So we have feminist agendas against indebtedness, and therefore uniting with the tenants unions to fight for the right to housing, especially for single women that are the leaders of the household. And I would like to share with you my invite to participate in this panel caused me to think, what are the vectors of politicization that we share in this point of contact between the feminist movement and the tenants union? Well, first, a sort of traffic in the good sense of the world of vocabularies between both sides, because I believe that both movements have been going through a process of politicizing the domestic sphere. of making what happens inside the homes political. And a very important fight in the tenants movements in Argentina has been to say that the price of rent is political, like the price of food, like the price of our electricity bill. It's all political. And here we have an important point in terms of how the feminist movement in Argentina has helped people see what happens inside homes as a political process and as places where the capital is also pushing people towards processes of accumulation. And here the pandemic served as an inflection point. So we need to think about the pandemic in terms of how it has meant more financial extractivism and a more real estate speculation. Within the feminist movement, we took a political stance to defend the rent law and to say that not only we want to talk about how the deregulation or the non-involvement of the state in the real estate market disproportionately impacts women, single women with children, lesbian women, gay people, trans people, racialized people. And we also wanted to discuss and take a stand in favor of the rent law in a moment where it was being attacked by different sectors. And the idea here was that the concentration of power in the real estate market is a concentration of power that impacts populations like the populations that we defend. And we started saying that regulating the real estate market was a deeply feminist demand. And when the real estate market is deregulated, the real estate power is the one that defines who can live in the city.
No sé si está pasando un slide o solo se está hablando. Estamos con dudas si el slide está pasando. Ahora está.
Lo quería pasar al
Pasar después, tranquila. Perfecto, siga, perdón.
Ok. ¿Cuántos minutos quedan?
Aún son 15 minutos. Entonces,
Ok, entonces sigo.
sí,
Sigue,
sí, por
estaba
favor.
maravillosa
Ok.
la conexión con el movimiento feminista. Por favor, Luci.
Ok, entonces decidimos desde el movimiento feminista. Espera un segundo porque estoy escuchando la interpretación.
Ah, just a second. Okay, now yes. Now we can move on.
A ver ahora si se escucha.
Now, do you hear me?
No. Entonces,
Okay.
definimos
So
tener un
we
posicionamiento,
defined
a
a
favor de
position
esta
in
ley de
favor
alquiler que
of
está siendo
this
atacada,
bill on
permanentemente
rentals,
en términos que la ley de alquileres
in
de
terms
alguna
that
manera
the
pone en
rental
crisis,
bill was
también
putting in
evidenciaba que
increase
hay
of
una
rights,
lucha de
or it
poder entre
made it
locatarios e
evident that there
inquilinos,
was this power
que
dynamic
esta ley de
between
alquileres
tenants
estaba
and
siendo
owners, and
utilizada
this
como
bill
herramienta de
was being
autodefensa
used
por
as a
muchas
defense
poblaciones que son
mechanism,
permanentemente
defense tool
expulsadas,
by many
por
populations that
ejemplo,
were usually
porque el mercado
expelled. For
inmobiliario
example,
expulsa
because
a las
the
personas,
real estate
por lo menos en Buenos
market
Aires,
expels
decide
in
que no
Buenos
quieren a
Aires
madres que crían solas,
by
o a parejas del mismo
deciding
sexo,
that
o
they
a
do
mujeres
not
trans,
want to
etcétera.
rent
Entonces,
the
creo que
real
hay
estate
un
to
punto de
trans
confluencia
people
importante
or single
que de alguna
moms
manera ha llevado a
or
esta zona de contacto
gay people.
entre
So this led
el movimiento
to
inquilino
this
y
contact between the
el
rent,
movimiento feminista.
the tenant
¿Dónde nos
movement, and the
encontramos
feminist
ahora, no?
movement. And
Yo particularmente con otras compañeras fui
currently,
parte del debate
I
en el
was
Congreso
part of the debate in Congress together with
hubo
other
durante el
colleagues
gobierno
that
anterior, durante la
was
vigencia de la ley,
carried
hubo
out
muchos intentos de reforma
during
y
the
de
past
derogación de la ley,
government, when which there
donde
were many
fuimos
bills
parte
and
del
many
debate en el
proposals
Congreso
for
y donde no
reform,
veíamos
And we were part of this debate in Congress in which we had this important setting where we could see that how the leadership in the extreme right saw this rental bill as a way to attack and the regulation of markets, because that's what they saw that had to be attacked. We have an extreme right in Argentina that is very liberal in the neoliberal sense, and was carrying out this program of extreme neoliberalism that it has as one of its pillars that the state and the in that regulates in favor of the most vulnerable populations had to end. So this is a very extreme neoliberalism, and we saw that this is what they were doing with regarding this law, the bill of the rent. So then we didn't notice that, and at the time, the election of the extreme right is one of the main enemies of all these movements, the the tenant movement, the environmental movement, the feminist movement, because it puts in evidence these modes of accumulation of wealth in the society. So this alliance between the extreme right was setting in a way, and we did not notice that they were the challenges that we were going to face later with this government. Something that is very important in relation to how these Argentinian extreme right not only proposes the deregulation of the market, but they also have this dollarization idea, which we have one of our main demands in the movement, that is to de-dollarize the housing market. I think that there hasn't been a movement like the tenant movement that put so much politicization around the currency in which the housing is process is marketed. It is also important to think about how the tenant movement was able to politicize and respond, a non-reactionary response to this instability and precarious situation for those who work in Argentina. And these are those items that the extreme right interprets very well. They propose an extreme market solution in which they observe that there's some kind of instability or some kind of annoyance in the population that the powers in the left did not notice, which they say when they say that the housing market should not be regulated. And now I'm going to conclude, and I would like to tell you what is happening since December, in which this extreme right government has taken a measure through a decree. The first government decree in chapter 1 is they revoked the bill on rentals. And this is very important in terms of how there is a dispute with this agenda of the extreme right. This innovation implies that today in Argentina, there is no regulation on this relationship between tenants and landlords. There is no regulation at the moment. The law that governs the contracts is the law of the day of the contract. So when you rent a house in here, is whatever is written in that contract, in this dynamic, this relationship. So the government has revoked that law, and also it has deregulated the of assets and services in the economy, while they've frozen wages and salaries. So the housing crisis has deepened, and I will show you figures that are unprecedented in Argentinian history, and it is very difficult to organize ourselves in one demand when you have so many other challenges in so many areas. One of the issues is that we have decided with the Union of Tenants to make a survey a quarterly survey to measure in real time the impacts of this deregulation. For example, the survey is measuring the changes in the real estate market since the revocation of the bill in December. For example, this is here in the summary, only 14% of current contracts are governed by the bill of rentals, and how this reduced the time of these contracts. In this case, contracts are they're lasting frequent, usually between 1 and 2 years. In 59% of cases, we have contracts that last between 1 and 2 years. However, 7 of each 10 tenants have signed new contracts after the deregulation. They have monthly increases or quarterly increases when it used to be annual increases in price. You have 5 minutes, Lucy, please. Very concrete data. 64% of tenants are indebted, according to this survey. And we see that this process that started with the pandemic is now stable. Today in Argentina, to live, to be a tenant and live by receiving a wage is to be always at risk and to be always in debt. And at this moment, almost 40% of income goes to rent since the deregulation. In the survey, we try to measure in real time the effects of this deregulation, especially because we have a state that is not measuring this situation. And also the media is installing an idea in the market that finally all the houses are on offer again since the revocation of the law. So these is false information, and in reality, if this offer grew, it's because to rent a house is still not affordable, and this has been accelerated because most housing projects are destined for use as Airbnb. And this is a very important figure, that is a participation in rent in income and the households is almost 50% with this deregulation. So I know we have very many challenges to advance and all these struggles and to join them, because we need to we have faced these challenges in our condition of living, and the rental market is one of the main demands. And in that sense, I think that it is a very concrete agenda against what the extreme right, or at least this colonialist version of the extreme right, is trying to do in our country. Thank you very much. And that was
Nós é que agradecemos muito, Luci.
We thank you, Lucy.
Eu posso falar português lentamente?
If I speak Portuguese, do you understand? Yes, yes, I do. Okay.
Mas, bom, nós é que agradecemos, né,
We would like to thank you both for your
agora eu vou
presentation.
colocar algumas
And I have a
perguntas,
few
que foram,
questions that were
dirigidas para a Luci e para a
directed
Marnie, tá?
to Marnie and to Lucy.
Qualquer pessoa que
And
esteja
anyone
acompanhando
who
aqui
is
pelo
following
YouTube,
us through on
pode
YouTube
também
can
mandar
also
mais
send
perguntas, tá?
your
Mas agora
questions.
a gente começa
But I'll start the
debate,
first round of
tá?
our debate.
Programado para durar 40 minutos.
And it
Então,
will
eu
last
vou
40 minutes.
começar com uma
I will
pergunta
start
da
with a
professora
question
Paula
from
Santoro,
Professor
e depois eu
Paula
gostaria de
Santoro,
fazer uma pergunta minha,
and then I have
né?
a question
Mas
of my
a
own.
pergunta da Paula diz o
Paula
seguinte:
asks,
eu
I would like to, first of all, express my solidarity to our speakers, because I feel in Marnie's tone that the difficulties, and I know that it's not by chance that the struggles in the housing sector are in the countries where the extreme right is in government. All these this capital that is in equity funds and multifamily funds are difficult to map and can enter or exit with complete liberty and is not affected by our lives, but impacts our lives. And do you think that we need to make a global strike? Because and this is a comment that also touches what was discussed in the previous panel. Because these processes were also discussed previously. The previous panel talked about local movements in the cities and strikes and collective alternatives. Some are pilot projects and some that were still attemptive in order to share the city and our life and to demercantilize and democratize housing. But they seem to be timid projects in face of the amount of capital that financializes rents. So the question is, how can we scale up these initiatives? Lucy, did you understand the question? Because I know Marnie has the English translation. So yes, I understood it. Do you want Marnie to start answering and then I'll answer? Marnie, do you agree
Yeah, it's
to
such
start?
a fantastic and important question, and I'm happy to hear that people were discussing our power and how we win is such an important question that housing justice groups, tenant rights groups are asking beyond just let's present why rent control or rent caps matter. The discussion has really shifted to how can we win them? We know how they matter in relationship to our lives, as Lucy was saying so clearly, especially for women who are keeping each other safe. And so in relationship to strikes, I do want to point out, I'm not quite sure if you're talking about rent strikes or if that was the conversation, or labor worker withdrawal of people's labor power. But I do think that we have to embody our power in ways that also protect and create spaces of care that have a very strong power analysis. For us, even during the pandemic, when there was a rent strike by default, May 1st, 2020, millions of people did not pay their rent. Some buildings did organize and were tenant associations both before and then born out of what was happening in relationship to people not having wages to pay their rent. But there was not an organized rent strike, so to speak. And I would say that that entails quite a bit of solidarity and analysis that can allow for people to do that in such a way that's effective and targeted. In relationship to financialization, one thing that I think some of us have learned in these larger portfolios is that despite the fact that the rent does matter, especially if we're paying on debt service, for many of these portfolios and buildings in the portfolios, they are seen as assets to leverage credit as cash, that they are seen, entire communities, as ways to have a real estate placement that is based on future transactions, whether that's rezoning, whether that's based on eviction, where the rent only counts so much in the calculation of some of these private equity-backed real estate portfolios. This is not always the case, but it is just something to keep in mind, especially when there are quite a lot of deals that are happening when the volume, the transaction is so fast, it is not necessarily the collection of the rent. It is the ability to leverage credit that financial institutions like private equity are really seeking, unless they have a longer term portfolio that expects a certain rate of returns that's not related just to a sale transaction of the future. But often credit is based on future potential rents, not of those who are there at the time of purchase. I think that we have some really strong base building groups that are exercising their power. Right now in Kansas City, there's been a 2-month rent strike that has actually yielded $1.5 million from Fannie Mae, which is one of the government quasi-public government securities that provides and backs mortgages to more than half of the rental properties in this country to those owners. And they, in Kansas City, have really, really clear demands around not just rehabilitating, renovating some uninhabitable units, and I'm talking of every single kind of distress, but also of ensuring that Fannie Mae, as a holder of so many mortgages and backing them with oftentimes the US Treasury as the securitization, ultimate securitization of some of these mortgages, that there is rent cap, rent protections, all different rental rights for tenants of buildings that have these mortgages that are often, not always private equity, but corporate landlords. And so this is what I mean by the advancement of tenant organizing, where using traditional tactics, perhaps like the rent strike in a building, but being very, very specific on the target in terms of being able to leverage for masses of buildings, hopefully a win that matters beyond their own community, which also matters so much. I'm not quite sure if there's going to be additional strikes related to that campaign. Again, that is a federally overseen entity. So within any kind of change of administration, there may not be as much power as they have right now. But the fact that they got $1.5 million just to right away, just to kind of like go away, I think demonstrates the power for rent strikes that are based on really, really high resident participation, but that there has to be a power analysis in relationship to whether we're talking about targeting the state for massive disruption or specific landlords and private equity firms, because they're quite a lot to organize, and people who are under threat of potential eviction, they can be very high stakes. And then, of course, strikes that are global strikes, I think are something to explore around so many different issues, but require that relationship and building power in one's own community too. Lucy, did you want to add on to that? I have so many things to say about what Lucy had to say because you're just so inspiring, but around strikes.
Sí, yo estoy
Yes,
muy de
I
acuerdo con lo que
am in full
dice
agreement
Marnie.
with what
Creo
Marnie said.
que estamos en un
And
momento
I think that we are living through a
donde
moment
pareciera
where
que estamos
it
luchando contra
seems that
cosas que
we are
son
fighting against things that
demasiado grandes,
are
y eso a veces
way too big.
devuelve
And
una imagen
sometimes this gives
de
us
impotencia que no es real,
an,
¿no?
a powerlessness
Creo que
feeling that is
está
not
habiendo
real.
un proceso
And
de
I think that
internacionalización de la
we are
lucha
having
inquilina
an
al mismo tiempo, que como
internationalization
decía la
process of the
profesora
tenant fight.
Marnie antes, es
And like
importante
Professor Marnie
eh,
said, it's
que hay que
important
trabajar en varios planos.
I think that we need to work on several fronts. It's important to nourish local organization, but at the same time have an international strategy and a cross-cutting strategy. For example, here we are doing very important work with the more interesting sectors in the unions so that they can include in their salary demands the cost of living. And we need to have these cross-cutting alliances that give us strength and that help us attack capital from several fronts. And this is also seems key to me, and internationalism is fundamental. I'll give an example. The same funds that are producing the that are speculating in the real estate market in Madrid are producing the real estate debt in Argentina. So how can we coordinate those who are being evicted in Madrid and those who are indebted in Argentina? So I think we need to work on several fronts. We need to strengthen locally without losing the international perspective and have increasingly cross-cutting agendas, knowing that we are in a time that is we're going through a global counter-offensive, but this should not make us cynical or depressive. And
Pesquisando, né,
I was
sobre
thinking about
a Marnie colocou na exposição
what
dela
Marnie
sobre essa
said in her presentation
multiescalaridade,
about this
né, da resistência
multi-scale
organizada dos
of the
inquilinos.
organized resistance of
E na
tenants.
exposição
And
da Luci, a
in
gente vê
Lucy's
processo que consegue transcender para
presentation,
uma
we see a
escala
process that
nacional, né?
can transcend
E
into a
eu,
national scale.
me corrija, Lucy, se eu estiver
And
entendido
correct
errado,
me,
mas me pareceu
Lucy,
que
if
uma
I'm
das
mistaken, but it
questões
seemed to me that one of
que
the issues
dificultou essa
that made it
transposição
hard
de escalas foi também
to
porque
change scales
partidos
was
progressistas, né,
the
partido
fact
esse
that
campo
progressive
institucionalmente
parties
organizado
and
trabalha
the
com
institutionally
paradigmas, né, e
organized
lógicas que
sphere
travam
works with
pouco
paradigms and
essa
logics that
fluidez, né? E aí é um
make
pouco
this
essa
process
coisa de
less fluid.
como a Raquel, né, a professora Raquel colocou
And like Professor
na
Raquel said
palestra de ontem, o
yesterday,
capital tem uma facilidade imensa
capital
de fluir por
has
todas
a
essas, né? Desde
huge
processos globais muito amplos
advantage in
até
being able
se construir em
to
nível
inhabit
local, né? Desde
the global
baixo,
sphere and also
enfim, com facilidade.
percolate the
Então eu
local
queria
sphere.
colocar para
And
vocês essa
I
pergunta
wanted to
também, né?
ask you this.
Esses como, como lidar um pouco também com essa
How can we
dificuldade, né?
deal with this
Traduz se eu compreendi
difficulty?
corretamente, né? Mas se como uma das dificuldades de transpor, de ganhar essas escalas é
As
também
one of another difficulty that we
romper
have in
com
gaining
algumas
scale, which
lógicas,
is
alguns
breaking with some
paradigmas, alguns
logics and some
repertórios que estão muito
paradigms and some
cristalizados, né?
repertoires
Nesse
that are
nosso
very much
campo.
crystallized, including in our field, in our progressive field.
Sí, nosotras
Yes,
enfrentamos
we have
en
faced,
este momento una crisis
and we are currently facing a
en la
crisis
clase política, en los
in
partidos
the political
políticos
class, in the
mayoritarios
political
y
parties, the
sobre todo
majority
una
parties,
crisis
and
de imaginación
especially
política.
a crisis in political
Porque
imagination,
paradójicamente lo que
because
sucede es que
a paradox that's happening is
en vez
that
de tener una
instead
lectura
of having a
en la cual
perspective in which
lleguemos a la conclusión de que
we
si la
reach the
ultraderecha
conclusion that if the
crece es
extreme
porque
right is
las
growing, it's
izquierdas
because
no están
the
siendo
left
suficientemente radicales
is
o no
not
están,
being
no están
radical
siendo
enough or is not
suficientemente eficaces para
being
leer
efficient
malestares,
enough
para
to
trabajar en las
relieve
necesidades y
the
malestares cotidianos de las personas. En vez de
daily
hacer esa
struggles that
lectura,
people
se
suffer.
culpabiliza
Instead
a
of
los
doing that,
movimientos
we
que
place
tienen
blame
agendas
in the
más radicales.
movements that have more radical
Ese es el
agendas.
problema que tenemos en este
And that
momento en
is the
Argentina.
problem that we have
Y
right now in
básicamente
Argentina.
hay dos
And
imaginarios
basically, there are
que
two
obturan la
forms of
organización
thinking
de los inquilinos,
that
sobre todo la organización de los inquilinos
are very pervasive in the tenants organizations, and especially in the tenants organizations that have the goal to discuss profitability and the naturalization that housing should be a profitable asset. And these perspectives are very much present in left-wing parties and are related to a very old logic in Argentina that is related to we all need to aspire to owning a house, and this creates a perspective that really obliterates the efforts of legislating about the current reality, which is the fact that we have increasingly more tenants. So we are working with an imaginary that everyone should eventually own a house. Therefore, we don't need to regulate the rent market, and we don't need to support the tenants' fight. And another perspective that is very much related to the way in which our countries have engaged in a developmentalism in the last few years. And one of the pillars that says that one of the pillars of economic growth is the building of housing and the real estate market. And it's impossible to regulate the real estate market because that would be meddling with the business that is the surplus of the agribusiness. There is a surplus in the agribusiness investors that move to the real estate market, and this with the complicity of political parties. And these forces act in a way to undermine the tenants' unions and the possibility of creating other forms of thinking in terms of access to housing that are not just the idea of owning a house.
I just wanted to comment on this last important statement that Luci was bringing up around the dilemmas within the politics of organizing and of the left. We too struggle with conceptualizing, imagining ownership as something that is shared, collective, that is not just tied to the lineage of property citizenship that is so active here. And we really see that the social housing work that's being proposed that we hope really does move forward within, I'd say, the next 5 years. This is not like a 1-year kind of campaign, but we really see socializing housing in relationship to being able to actually bricks and mortar convert existing speculative housing into resident controlled housing that is permanently affordable, but with public control and even public ownership of the land underneath, a kind of community public land trust as a way to reconceptualize also what it means to be an owner and to own one's participation in community and hopefully in democratic decision-making that allowed for that potential conversion to even happen, which, by the way, one of the legislations that we're attempting here in New York City and New York State is around the tenant opportunity to purchase, which is when there's a transaction, when there's a sale, to have first right of refusal for the renters. This is only as good as there is financing in relationship to direct state subsidies to allow for renters to purchase their home. But this is something that exists in Washington, D.C. There's community opportunity to purchase in San Francisco, and we're very much fighting for that here as a way to think about and collectivize ownership. Certainly, we have a great problem and challenge of an almost dissolved safety net, so to speak, in relationship to how people understand housing and housing ownership as their future, meaning that without having a retirement, like some public sector workers do, that people do rely on this idea of home and equity as cash assistance, as income in the future that can be drawn from. And we have Zillow and all of these different kinds of apps, programs that monitor housing value, where anyone can just go onto Google in the United States, put in their address, and find the value of their home. And people do this all the time as an attempt to also think of their own home as investment in their future. So we really believe that the fight for housing is also a fight for all different kinds of life affirming welfare supports of the state that allow for people to think of their futures as beyond just what is cash available from a home, which is just for the very few who are able to have equity built up over time. And of course, we saw just monumental losses in any kind of intergenerational wealth among Black and Brown households in the United States during the foreclosure crisis, which has just been exacerbated by the tremendous amount of rent that people who have been foreclosed are paying, sometimes in the very same communities in single family homes that have been converted to rentals by Wall Street, Blackstone, those who are responsible for the predatory loans that led to foreclosures to begin with. But all of this is just to say that this does create the kind of dilemma of trying to create and imagine at the same time to have the alternative that hopefully not just opens up far more possibility, but also shifts power that brings people into practice together and decision-making together, that allows us to get to other scales of governing. And this is something that, you know, we'll be fighting for at the municipal and state level, knowing that at the federal level, there won't be much traction. But I do still think in relationship to direct action and other forms of disruption that there certainly be all different kinds of targeting of national and international finance as people continue to just wrestle with the tremendous inequalities and criminalization of inequalities, where we have encampments that the Supreme Court in the United States has allowed for localities to now remove people who have nowhere to go, who have created informality, tents, communities sometimes, but without any kind of housing program to go to. And so we're seeing just the many different ways that social control has already been used through policing, carceral logics among those who have been facing these inequalities for especially this last decade. And so we're very much concerned and will be very much invested in protecting those who are most exposed to the social control that we anticipate with this new administration, regardless of the politics and parties of the city or the state where one lives.
Chegaram mais algumas perguntas.
We have a few more questions.
Posso fazer 2 blocos, Luci e
May
Marnie?
I do 2 additional blocks, Lucy and Marnie? I will.
Daí já vai se encaminhando pro
No, actually, one more
encerramento.
block. I will ask a few more
ser?
questions and then we can
Acho que
move on
chegou uma
to
questão,
close the panel. I
dando
think
para
we have a
entender as
question.
perguntas?
Are you able to
Marnie,
understand the
a tradução
questions?
tá
Marnie,
ok,
through the
Lucy,
translation,
ok,
Lucy, can you
ok.
understand in
Tá bom, qualquer
Portuguese?
coisa
Okay,
vocês me
great.
avisem,
So
tá?
let me know if you have any problems.
Mas chegou uma saudação
But
de
I have here
uma militante do coletivo Aluguel em Crise,
a greeting of an
da Fernanda
activist
Neves,
from
que
the
ela dizia,
Rent in
boa noite, pessoal.
Crisis
Muito importante as falas, compartilhando
movement. She says,
históricos
good
que
evening,
possibilitam
guys.
os
Very
inquilinos no
important
mundo.
what you
Eu
have
fiz
to
parte do
say,
coletivo
sharing the
Aluguel em
historic.
Crise
And
durante a
experiences all around the world. I was part of the renting crisis movement. I would like to ask two questions. First, in Brazil, the idea of owning a house and property is very strong. How have you seen this discussion in your work, and how can we defend more radical possibilities that question private property in the tenant fight? And also, how was it for you, the change in organization after the pandemic? Because this was a moment that really demobilized the collective, the post-pandemic. And you have addressed many of these issues already, but if you want to make comments and just get back to Fernanda.
Quer começar?
¿Yo? Ok.
Pode ser.
Sí.
You can go first. Okay.
A ver, creo que
I believe
em,
that
para discutir el
in order
imaginario
to
de propiedad,
discuss the
digo, creo
this
que la lucha
very
inquilina es una de las
idea
luchas
of
que
owning a house,
más
I
lo
think the
ponen en crisis,
tenants
pero no hay que
fight
perder de
and
vista que
activism
además estamos en un
that
contexto, por lo
really
menos
questions
en
this
Argentina
idea of ownership, but we are in
y
a context, at
y
least
en
in
varios lugares del mundo
Argentina
donde
and
la
in several
ultraderecha
places
ha
around the world
tomado
where the extreme right
como
has
punta de lanza la reposición de cierta idea de la
taken
de propiedad.
over
Y
and
nosotros
has
esa
reinstalled this
propiedad,
idea of ownership
si
and
la
of
propiedad
private
funciona de
property,
alguna manera en la cual
especially
casi
if
se
the
transforma en una
property
especie de
works in
fantasma,
a
¿no?
way that
Que no
is
se puede
somewhat of a ghost,
efectivizar,
because you
pero
can't
actúa
deliver
permanentemente
on that
en la
promise,
subjetividad de las
but
personas.
it acts in people's
Y
imagination.
es muy importante
And
poner esta
it's very
discusión.
important
Yo
in
creo
this
que
discussion
la discusión sobre
to
la
say
imaginación de la
that
propiedad se puede
the
dar a
very
partir de,
imagination we
bueno,
have about
experiencias concretas que
ownership
ya hay
can
y
happen
otros tipos de
based on concrete
maneras de
experiences
acceder a
that
la
we
vivienda,
have in
como las que estuvo
other ways of
contando
accessing
Bernie en Estados
housing,
Unidos,
as the
experiencias de
ones
Estados
that
Unidos, pero
Marnie
que también
mentioned in the
hay
US,
en
the
Brasil y en
experience in the
Argentina
US, but
otro
also
tipo
experiences that we have in Brazil and
propiedad que no está
Argentina,
individual
and other
u
types
otro
of
tipo de
property which is not
experiencias que ponen
individual, and other types of
en
experiences that
discusión la idea de
can
una de la propiedad
bring
tal
to the
cual
debate the
la
idea
tenemos
of property
incorporada como un imaginario que termina,
in the way that
creo
it's
que
currently
impidiendo
incorporated in people's
la
imagination,
organización a partir
to
de lo que hoy ya
prevent
somos,
the
que es
organization based on
inquilinos
the
e
current
inquilinas,
situation,
trabajadores y trabajadores
which is the fact
precarios,
that we are
y no futuros
tenants, that we
propietarios.
work in
Ese es el
precarious
problema
condition,
más
and
grande, que
maybe
la
in the future
propiedad
we could be
funciona como una
owners.
especie
That is the
de horizonte,
biggest
un
issue,
futuro
that
que
the
contiene
property works
digamos
as
que
a
actúa
future
despotenciando la acción
horizon
política actual
that
sobre una condición que ya tenemos,
deactivates the
que es la
political
de
action
inquilinos y
right
la de inquilinas.
now
Entonces, creo que hay
on
que
our
trabajar
current
en
condition,
varios
which is the fact
niveles
that we are
esta discusión.
tenants.
Primero,
So I think we should
trabajando desde
work
una
with
especie
this
de
discussion on several
actualización
levels.
realista,
First,
¿no? Que es,
updating,
bueno, ¿cuál es hoy
realistically
la principal
updating
forma de
our
acceso de la clase
imagination. What
obrera
is
a la
currently the
vivienda?
main
¿Cuáles son las
form of
experiencias
access of the
mayoritarias de
working
nuestro
class
pueblo
to housing?
en
What
términos de
are
acceso a
the
la
main
vivienda? Y vamos
experiences
a
of
ver
our
que,
people in
bueno,
terms
en
of
el caso de
access
las
to
mujeres es
housing?
mucho más marcado,
And in the case of
hay muchas
women,
menos
this is
posibilidades de ser
very
propietarios.
clear. There
Esto
is
ni hablar
much less
cuando además
possibility of
pensamos
them
en términos
becoming
de raza.
owners. And when we think about
Y cuál es
racial terms as
efectivamente
well,
la forma
and
de
what
acceso a
is
la vivienda
actually the
de
way
quienes
in
viven de
which
su
we
trabajo.
access
La
housing
otra
if
disputa
you live
está
from your
en
own
cómo
work?
trabajamos discutiendo una idea de propiedad en un momento de
The other
tanta
dispute is
incertidumbre,
to think,
donde
how do we
incluso
work,
la
think of
idea en
ownership
algún
when
momento de vivir en
since with such
propiedad funciona
uncertainty,
como una
especially
especie
when
de
this future property comes as a
calma algún tipo de
like
ansiedad que da el
it calms
presente, ¿no?
our
El
present
presente produce todo el
anxiety. The
tiempo, el
present
neoliberalismo
produces
está produciendo
neoliberalism, and it is
inseguridades e
that this
incertidumbres radicales
neoliberalism
en todos
is
los aspectos
creating
de la vida.
radical
Y la idea de
uncertainties
devenir
and
propietarios muchas
anxiety.
veces
And this
es una
idea
forma de
of
calmar
becoming
esa incertidumbre.
owners
Entonces hay que
kind of
trabajar incluso en
calms
un
down
plano
this uncertainty and
incluso de
anxiety. So
disputa
we need a
afectiva y de
plan
disputa de
of
cómo
an effective
imaginamos
dispute
el
and of
futuro
of
y
an
cuál
effective
es el
struggle
rol
at
que
how
ese,
we
de
imagine the
esa
future
promesa
and what is the
permanentemente
role that
incumplida
this
del neoliberalismo
promise that
de
is
transformarnos en
never
propietarios
met
o de
and
transformarnos en
of
personas
transforming ourselves, of
con
becoming
la vida
owners
estabilizada en algunos
uh,
puntos.
or to stabilize our life in some points. Today, the property has gathers discussion that go beyond the statistics, and they are the and are related to this uncertainty that neoliberalism is generating in our lives. And with regards to the pandemic, for us, it was a moment of great disarticulation and dismantlement because of the impossibility of movement, but also because it generated a crisis, a social crisis, which also goes against the production of struggles. What this implies is that when we have so many people indebted and with job problems, these are problems that individualize the costs of austerity. So the struggle, and you have to fight against those provisions that keep us within our household and the cost of austerity. I believe that it took us over one year to rebuild the networks that we had prior to the pandemic. So, because the pandemic also separated the rural and urban struggles, the meetings from of tenants from the cities and from the peripheries. So it brought about spatial barriers, and it took us over a year to overcome that pandemic period. And the pandemic also worked in favor of the extreme right movements to attack the social. It's not only a sanitary crisis, but also there were opportunities, political opportunities within that sanitary health crisis that we are suffering till today. And we have to see how the pandemic and how impacted us, and how, from the perspective of the movement, how we were impacted by that crisis.
Bom, então,
Okay, so Lucy and Marnie, I'm going to ask the final questions. And after that, I will ask both of you to start thinking about your final remarks, and because unfortunately we have this time limit that can only go until 7 p.m. That means only 15 more minutes. So I will ask these final questions. I ask you to just start concluding this very important debate. The final questions are related to some issues that have already been mentioned, like Julian Jimenez says that thanks Lucy for the presentation, and asks, I would like to know how this movement for regulating and rents and for protecting tenants can functions in informal areas. Do you see paths in that direction so that's Luciana Jimenez's question about the informality. And Paula Santora also has a final question, which is the following. The previous panels showed the need to regulate rents, while those panels that discuss policies talk about the markets and to make the markets more accessible with the decrease of rentals, and they seem not to be becoming more affordable. So how do we deal with all these different regulations? One that wants to limit the income coming from rents, and others that wants to ban them. And how do we face the resistance from tenants and rentiers? Is it another question that we saw on the chat and another panel? If rent is so financialized, why should we think, is it possible to think of a rental policy? Yeah, so these are the final issues that Paula raises. Lucy, would you like to start and answer the question on informality? Can you please? Okay, so the question is, how do you generate alliances between the sectors, right? If I understood it right, the first question.
nessa linha. Então, ela
Yes, in that
pergunta
line, she's asking
como que a mobilização
how
para
does
regulação dos
mobilization
aluguéis
to
e proteção
regulate
dos
rent
inquilinos se
and protection
relaciona
of
com os
tenants is
aluguéis
related
informais
to
e
the informal
populares, e se vocês
rents
têm
in
feito essa
popular
articulação e
areas, and
visto
if you have
caminhos para
made
fazer
this
uma
kind of
articulação nessa
articulation
linha.
and see paths
Sí,
to this
eh,
articulation.
eso es importante
Yes,
porque
it's
eso
very
es,
important because
en
I
este
believe
momento
that
es
at this moment,
el
this
déficit más grande que tenemos,
is
que
the
es
greatest
que
deficit we
en los
face,
momentos en que
because
se moviliza el
at the
sindicato de
times when we
inquilinos,
have this
cuesta generar
tenant market
al mismo tiempo una
mobilized,
movilización
at the same
de lo que
time
serían
we need a
los
mobilization
inquilinos de lo que acá se llaman
of what
asentamientos,
we
allá se llaman
call
favelas.
settlements, and you call favelas or
Y eso
slums.
lo conseguimos
And
cuando
we can achieve
podemos
that
desplegar en
when
dinámicas
we are able
feministas,
to
porque
deploy
en los
in the
asentamientos que tenemos
feminist
funcionando asambleas
movement, for example,
feministas
because we have
sí
feminist
agrupan
assemblies that
y generan
gather
alianzas entre
and generate
de
alliances in these
distintos
areas
tipos de
between
acceso a la
different
vivienda en
types
alquiler,
of
pero cuando lo hacemos
access
por fuera de las organizaciones
to
feministas
how
cuesta
rental
más
housing. But when we do it
generar esas
outside of
alianzas
this our feminist
porque
movement,
en
it's more
general
difficult to create these alliances because in
el grupo
general
de inquilinos
the
más,
tenant movement
más asociado a los
that is
asentamientos o
mostly
al mercado
associated
informal,
to the informal market or to
tiene
these
como
settlements or
cierta,
slums has
de alguna manera, cierta reticencia a
it
ver en
kind
la
of
ley de alquileres leyes
hesitates
que
to
de alguna
see
manera
in the
también
bill
regula lo que
of
pasa en
rentals
las
to
villas.
how
Pero
it sees it
es
that
un
it will
problema
regulate what also
discusión
happens
política que
in
tenemos
these
actualmente, porque
neighborhoods,
lo
and
que
that's a
nosotros
political
planteamos
problem that
es
we
que
see
cuando se
have,
desregula
because
un
what we
mercado,
say
eso
is
se
that when you
derrama esa
deregulate
desregulación, y es lo que
the
está pasando,
market, that
al resto,
also
al resto
spills
del
over
mercado,
to the
incluso si
rest
es
of
un
the
mercado
market,
informal,
include even to the
porque,
informal
el mercado
market.
informal toma
So
como
the
referencia
informal market has as a
lo que sucede
reference
en el
what
mercado informal.
happens in the
Entonces,
formal market.
lo que está funcionando
So what
actualmente es
happens
más la,
what
la
happens
organización de mujeres
right now is that
capaz
the
de
women's
discutir
organizations
desde
are
distintos puntos de
more
vista el acceso a
able
la
to
vivienda.
discuss access to
Y en
housing
relación a
from
lo que
different
decía
points of
Paula,
view. And in
a lo que
relation to what
preguntaba
Paula
Paula, yo
said
creo
or what
que
she asked,
en este
is
momento
I
nosotros
believe
estamos
that
luchando
presently we are
porque
struggling
se logre volver a
to
la ley de alquileres y
achieve
eso
that we
significaría que las dos
reinstate
cámaras del
the
Congreso
bill or the
rechacen
law
el
for
decreto del
rentals, and
gobierno
that means
inconstitucional.
that the Congress, both
Pero
houses
yo
of
creo que hay
Congress,
que
have
trabajar
to
en
go
varios
against what
niveles. Por
the
ejemplo, también estamos
government.
en un
But
proyecto
we are
para
also in a project to
regular la cuestión de las viviendas vacías
regulate
en la ciudad
the
de Buenos Aires.
in Buenos Aires, they
Creo
opened
que el
up
horizonte tiene que
unoccupied
ser hacer
houses.
todo lo
And
posible
what we
para que
have
la
to do
vivienda
is
sea rentable, no
we
sea
have to make that
un bien de
housing is
especulación.
not
Y
a
eso implica
speculation asset.
regulación,
And that
implica
means regulation, implies more
discusión
discussions,
política,
political
discusión
debate,
incluso con un
and
ethos neoliberal que
with
empieza a
a
transformar
new,
todo
you have to discuss and dialogue
y
with
que
a
está
new
muy instalado en
liberal
este momento en el que
situation
todo tiene que
that is based
un bien de
on
especulación
that everything has to
y que
become a
se puede
speculation
trabajar en
asset
distintos
and
aspectos.
that can
Uno
be
obviamente
worked
es,
from different
para nosotros
aspects.
sería muy importante
And for
que el
us, it would
precio,
be very important that
que
the
los aumentos de los
prices
alquileres vuelvan
or
a
the
estar
increase
fijados en
in
frecuencia
rent
y con
should
alguna
be
referencia
fixed with
pública.
enough
Eso sería un
in
gran
its frequency and with a
avance
fixed
en este
public
momento y bueno,
indicator, for
en lo que
example.
sabemos que es por eso
Because we
totalmente
know that at
contracultural,
the
porque estamos
present
con un
moment that
gobierno
is
de ultraderecha.
countercultural because we have this extreme right government, so it's
Así
very
que bueno,
difficult.
dejo por acá si puede
Well,
hablar
I'll
Marnie,
just
que la
conclude here
respuesta
so
anterior no
Marnie
le
can
gustó.
also talk and give her final remarks.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to say a little bit more about the also psychology of individualism and how we need to challenge that in so many different ways. The credit cards that now people use to pay rent in the United States include rewards for paying rent, point systems to be able to use for restaurants, for potentially travel. This is a way to incentivize people to get credit cards, consumer credit cards, which are debt, another layer of debt that also obviously is the gap between people's wages and what they can afford for living. And these are ways also to attempt to undermine organizing, as individuals see themselves as rewarded for paying the rent, as getting something off from their landlord. This is something that's like becoming ubiquitous, especially in cities like New York, where there's just like a huge advertising campaign around these kinds of credit cards. I only bring up the credit cards to say that we should be with our neighbors negotiating with our landlords. And of course, bringing that up to the multi-scalar levels and of escalating kinds of tactics that Victor had posed. And we're not going to do that when we're thinking about rewards and points on credit card. And then, of course, how to deal with the burden of that debt on top of many other layers of debt that people and households carry. And so to exercise power directly, to assume ownership of one's home, regardless of a contract that's rental based or otherwise, is to demand that the landlord, their representative, must actually be in a position of bargaining with you or with the renters around negotiating all different kinds of terms of rent. And of course, having a city or state where there's rent regulation should be something that is universal for all different rental households. But in relationship to where there's not, or where that is just simply the ceiling and you can push down rent with an individual landlord, I think in many different ways, we need to think very creatively and very carefully about how we can organize where we are in relationship to exercising power, to do all of the many different kinds of brilliant work that's happening that Luci had brought up within communities that are attempting to bring this to levels of government, but also from one community to another. And that is the kinds of translocal work that is been just very important to this Right to the City Alliance, learning from each other, regardless of whether we have the same target, but learning tactics and also beginning to identify who might be some common targets. So I also want to say that there are all of these different kinds of price setting, rent setting tools that are out there for individual landlords, people who might just have a duplex, meaning they own the small building and they have one apartment and they're renting the other, who use tools of private equity because now they're actually available on the internet to begin to price set to the highest that the market could bear, which is not actually what people can bear. And this is creating, again, this investor mindset of one's own home, not just if it's an individual home, but for small landlords. And that kind of commodification and mindset is based on a need to attempt to shore up one's income sometimes, not necessarily just by private equity, but I'm talking about individuals who are living in conditions that might include that they have something to rent if they're lucky enough, but that are not really tenable for themselves either in relationship to their mortgage debt. And so beginning to think of ourselves and our neighbors as people who hopefully can have the kinds of relationships that allow us to talk about rent and what we're paying and what's happening as far as what we even know out there of who might be the landlord, because so many times people don't know who actually owns their building in the case of corporate landlords. So yes, I will just kind of leave that there. I do want to say that there's all different ways that people are used against each other in relationship to encampments that become criminalized if they're on the property of a store that might have a parking lot, that store gets a fine. The store owner or the person who's working at the shop becomes the enforcer of these laws by saying, you have to leave this, we can't have you here. And of course, all different ways in which, including in New York City, the Department of Sanitation is used to now have authority to give tickets to street vendors, to demolish encampments of people who have already been dislocated, serially displaced from home and to street, who are creating in some kind of way, as much as people can, an attempt at safety and place. And again, this will be an area for, I think, tremendous solidarity in the United States ahead, in our cities, given that not only do we have some advancement in tenant organizing, but we really do see that those who are most exposed to state social control, to policing, that in the years to come, we need to absolutely be building across many different sectors. That's far beyond just the renters who have a place to call home tonight.
Bom, infelizmente esse é o nosso teto, né? Mas em primeiro lugar eu queria agradecer profundamente.
Unfortunately, our time is up, but I would like to thank
Eu queria agradecer
I'd like to
profundamente a
thank
profundamente a
Marnie and
Para nós
Lucy.
foi
For
foi
us,
privilégio,
it
foi
was
uma
a
satisfação
privilege and a
receber
pleasure
vocês
to
para esse
have you
debate.
here in our
Eu acho que
discussions.
vocês trouxeram
You brought
questões e perspectivas
issues and
teóricas e de prática
perspectives,
política com muita
practical and
força, que são
theoretical,
extremamente
that are
necessárias,
very powerful and very
especialmente nesse
necessary,
momento, essa
especially at
conjuntura muito
this
adversa que a gente
present
está
moment that is
enfrentando,
very
nos Estados
adverse
Unidos,
in
Argentina,
that
aqui
we
no
are facing in the
Brasil.
United
Me
States, in
parece que
Argentina, and
aqui
even
em
here
São
in
Paulo,
Brazil.
onde nós
I
falamos, onde
think that
nós
here in
estamos
São Paulo, where
sediados,
we
essa
are
reflexão que vocês
headquartered, this
trouxeram
discussion that you brought
extremamente
about
importante,
is
central e
extremely
ainda tem
important.
muito
It's
pouco a
central
fundo
and
teórico de
it
prática política,
still
então
lacks a
esse debate
political
foi
practice and a
muito
theoretical
importante,
accumulation of
né?
content. And so it was
Mas eu
really,
queria
really
agradecer
important to us.
profundamente a
So
vocês
once
duas,
again, I would
né?
like to really
Agradecer a
thank
todas as
both
pessoas
of
que nos
you and thank
acompanharam aqui
everyone
até
who is
essa hora,
following us
para todas as pessoas que podem assistir
online,
depois
and
esse
those
debate,
also
vai ficar
everyone
gravado, né?
who
Como eu
will
disse, é só acessar lá
follow and watch
no
this
canal,
debate later on
né?
because it's being recorded and
É
it will be
isso,
made
pessoal.
available on
A
our
gente encerra
website.
por aqui.
So
Amanhã
I would
tem
like
mais, né? Amanhã, a
to
partir das
close our
10h30, a
panel
gente tem uma
here. We
mesa
will be
sobre
here
essa
tomorrow
desregulação
at
do aluguel,
10:30 in
né?
our
Então, o
panel
cenário
about
continua e a gente
financialization
se
of
despede por aqui.
rent. So we'll have our seminar continues, and I would like to say goodbye here and see you later. See you tomorrow.